Yo, what's up? This is Koski of Fun Day back at it once again, kicking in for you and for yours. You know what I'm saying? And as always, I give a shout out to my ancestors for giving me the knowledge, wisdom, and understanding. And, as usual, I give a shout out to y'all for, what I'm saying, watching, liking, the lookership, whatever you do. You know what I'm saying? I give much praises and respect to y'all for, because the channel is growing and been doing this thing. Now, this one right here, we're going to deal with the archaeological of Maroon societies in America, resistance, cultural continuity, and the transformation of African disposal. This is written by Terry Wilk, you know what I'm saying? And many people don't believe, when they get to like the narrative about Africans here in the so-called New World, they don't talk about the Maroon colonies they had over here and stuff like that, because everybody wasn't fit for that slavery stuff, you know what I'm saying, and the things they set up. So without further ado, we're going to get into this. Archaeology has been initiated in Maroon sites in various parts of the African diaspora in America. Data from Jamaica, Dominican Republic, Brazil, Florida, and North Carolina was surveyed in order to examine the direction that the studies of Maroon societies have taken. An assessment is in order so the future studies can be planned with kindness of the problems and the possibilities that the current research has uncovered. Approaches, theories, archaeological evidence are analyzed and critiqued and placed within the context of African diaspora archaeology. The archaeology of the Maroon sites is rich and virtually untapped area of study. The archaeological study of Maroon sites will advance our knowledge of Africans and Americans by fostering new perspectives on traditional concepts such as ethnicity, resistance, cultural contact, cultural continuity, and change. Introduction. Maroon are people from the African diaspora who escaped enslavement and lived independently from the plantation societies in America. Examining Maroonage and the formation of Maroon in the African diaspora perspective is an important means of adding of discourse of African agencies beyond the African continent. Diaspora, a Greek word meaning to disperse or to spread, originally referred to the global dispersal of Jewish peoples. It has been adopted by researchers studying the African diaspora because people of African descent have experienced a similar history of migration, forced and voluntary enslavement and persecution in various parts of the world. African diaspora denotes the shared experiences, whether oppression and cultural ties to Africa or political ideology, i.e. Pan-Africanism. At the same time, a diaspora perspective illuminates the cultural, geographical, and historical dimensions that distinguish people of African descent. The archaeology of Maroonage reflects the wide scope of African diaspora in the Americas, which spans 2 continents and the Caribbean. The following discussion is centered on archaeological investigation of Maroon sites at Palmares, Brazil, Joseph Leta, the Dominican Republic, Pilaklikaha and Fort Moses, Florida, Nannytown, Accompong, and Seamansley, Jamaica, and Culpepper Island, North Carolina. Other sites that deserve mention are those of embryos and Minogarvas in Brazil, and in cave sites located near Havana, Cuba. As migrants, slaves, and exiles, Africans had traversed the Atlantic in 2 directions. In light of this fact, archaeology might one day recover valuable information on the Nannytown Maroons, who were deported to Nova Scotia and then sent to Sierra Leone after the Second Maroon War in 1796. All right? So there's a Second Maroon War. We don't even know about the first one. They want to have it in Canada. Maroon, the definition. The English word, maroon. Like the French word maroonage, has been credited to the Spanish word meaning cimarron, which originally referred to escaped cattle or hogs, which ran to the mountains. In Spanish colonies, Maroon settlements were referred to as Palicas or Marabistas in Cuba. In Brazil historiography, a Maroon community is called a Calimbo or Mana or Manamo or Mocambo. Maroonage, like rebellion, occurred wherever slavery existed. A distinction is made between the 2 types of Maroonage activity, Petit Maroonage, and Grand Maroonage. Petit Maroonage refers to a short-term escape of enslaved people. Grand Maroonage refers to long-term or permanent escape within living of the autonomous communities. Enslaved Africans, for various reasons, to avoid forced labor, to heal from wounds inflicted by abusive overseers, to find food, to visit family members such as spouse or relatives on other plantations, or to interact with friends or potential mates. In many places, the male to female ratio was quite high during slavery. In addition to desire of freedom of cultural expression such as religious worship, led to enslaved people from flee temporarily or permanently. As anthropologist Richard Price demonstrated Maroon societies, Maroonage varied at times, space, and carried throughout the Americas. Small Maroon sites such as Jose Leta in the Dominican Republic and Pilaklikaha in Florida range from 5 or less around to 100 inhabitants. Larger Maroon sites such as Nannytown and Accompong in Jamaica and Culpepper Islands in North Carolina had hundreds of Maroons. Palmares in Brazil was an extreme end of the size range with estimated 5,000 to 20,000 people. As with the size and duration of occupation varied from Maroon settlements in different periods and places. Historical documents suggest that most Maroon settlements were short-lived. For instance, Raymond Kent, 1979, affirmed that 7 out of 10 of the highest Columbos in Brazil were destroyed within 2 years of formation. However, Palmares proved to be an exception, lasting 100 years. In colonial Florida, Black Seminole sites such as Old Abrahamtown lasted several decades. By contrast, Maroon settlements in Jamaica and Suriname had lasted from the 18th century to the 1990s. In general, Maroon enclaves were found in inaccessible and marginal areas. The right kind of environment was necessary for successful flights and Maroonage. Black Seminoles found refuge in Central Florida swamps. Some Maroons thrived in the forest and the riverbanks of Suriname. Brazilian, Cuban, and Jamaican Maroon communities could not have enjoyed longevity without the formidable mountains and dense vegetation hills on which they settled. The environment was also important for subsistence needs. Brazilian Columbus produced many crops through horticulture, such as manioc, tobacco, cotton, bananas, corn, pineapple, and sweet potatoes. Honey, beeswax, and gang were acquired from Maroons in the forests of Cuba. A large number of Maroons, such as the Pilaklikaha of Cuba, went through 2 stages of development. First, there was the nomadic stage. At a found a defensible location, Maroons moved to the second stage of development, a sedentary life. In many cases, Maroons set up fortified plantations. Maroons were not isolated, nor were they merely concerned with escape, for they raided colonial settlements and plantations for commodities and new recruits. They traded crops and forest products with pirates and European traders in exchange for weapons or tools. As Maroons were threats to the obedient attitudes of the slave owners demanded of their slaves, colonists reacted by attempting to destroy them. If military confrontation failed, colonists signed treaties with Maroons. Some Europeans tried to undermine each other by forming trade and military alliances with Maroons, thereby instigating Maroon raiding parties to destroy the commerce of their colonial rivals. Preoccupied by fighting and competing for land and resources in a strategically located area, European forces sometimes neglected checking the growth of the Maroons. The disorder caused by European rivalries purposely facilitated the escape for many of enslaved people, for the planters could not control a considerable amount of people without a stable, united front among European militia and patrol. In sum, the history of Marooners demonstrates a pervasiveness of the Maroons in a wide variety of places throughout the Americas. Their ability to undermine plantation societies make Maroons more worthy of continual investigations. Historical and archaeological analysis. Historical and archaeological analysis have been based on research questions and have addressed the archaeology of the African diaspora, historical supplementation, and maroon settlements. Each of these facets is discussed more fully below. Resource questions, resistance, and archaeological evidence. As above, the definition illustrates the historical graph of maroonage as matured through the stage of description and the location of maroon communities. Yet it's important that the maroon sites be investigated more intensively and more extensively. For recent studies have demonstrated they are a rich and virtually untapped area of archaeological study. There are a number of fundamental questions that have guided the following examination of maroon archaeology. For example, how does maroon archaeology fit in the discourse of archaeology of the African diaspora? What problems of historical interpretation have guided the research on maroon communities? Also, what special theoretical issues pertain to maroon sites? Finally, why should archaeology be employed to study maroons? With these issues in mind, and the goals of this article is to critique maroon archaeology, suggest new avenues of investigation. Archaeology and the African diaspora. Plantations have been the focus of often historical archaeology in African diaspora. Most plantation studies have been conducted in North America, where social political movements of the 1960s and federal legislation helped convince archaeologists to study early African Americans. Charles Osser, who has done research on plantation and maroon archaeology, has observed that historians and anthropologists have given a disappointing attention to the master-slave relationship. This overemphasis has been noted by others. The archaeological investigation of the colonial period, free blacks, and post-period black communities have offered alternative avenues of research. Now that the slave sites on plantations have been explored, much of the work must be done by expanding archaeological discourse on Africans and Americans. Beyond the plantation context, the archaeological investigation of maroon sites have emerged in the 1980s and 1990s as another alternative to the sole study of plantations. Thus far, the general goals of maroon archaeologists have been modest. Archaeologists have sought to set locale sites, expand new research arenas, survey sites boundaries and features, and test settlement patterns. In general, archaeologists of maroonage have met these goals. Sites are located, artifacts recovered, and foundations for future investigations established. Archaeologists study maroon sites such as Pilaklikaha and Culpepper Island and Palmares have pursued archaeological questions related to the environment adaptations, land use, living conditions, and cultural contact. In the future, maroon archaeology will likely address the traditional themes that have emerged in the African diaspora archaeology, such as everyday living conditions, health and ethnic identity, settlement patterns, colonial wear, symbolism and ritual objects, housing construction, social organization, cultural contact, and resistance. Africanism, to transfer African traits to this board, is a popular theme that archaeologists have examined by discerning food ways, building techniques, and pottery traditions. Maroon sites may be important testing ground for cultural communities and changes which are manifested in colon ware types of pottery which have been uncovered. Colon ware is a term for plain earthenware which originally attributed to the Native American potters, but is now attributed to either African American or Native American potters, or both, depending on historical and geographical context. Both Jamaican and Brazilian maroon sites have yielded planet earthwares of local productions which may have been African, Native American, or sent inspiration as colonware. According to one documentary source, the account of Johan King, a member of the Nannytown Maroons of Jamaica, the women made giant clay pots to cook things in. Likewise, they made big clay pans in big tubs which could hold a lot of water. They made water jugs, big ones and little ones. Hence, one could purpose that some maroon sites were producers of their own earthenwares. Maroon archaeology will provide an important advantage to which to evaluate the colonial wares debates by aligning precisely linkage between the variants of wares and Pacific communities. Theoretically, Maroon archaeology can contribute to the ever-increasing corpus of concerning resistance. Resistance to slavery and colonialism in the Americas can be compartmentalized as including but not limited to behaviors such as sabotage, feigned sickness, intentional tool damage, strikes, slowdowns, poisoning, and arsoning. Before they came to the shores of Americas, Africans rebelled on slave ships. Orlando Patterson, 1969, proposed that both passive and violent forms of slave resistance existed. Essentially, resistance to slavery and colonial domination seemed best viewed in the continuum of behaviors with more everyday forms of resistance, such as work slowdowns, tool damage on one end, and revolt, flight, and maroonage, and establishment of runaway settlements, and moral confrontational and a violent end of the spectrum. Archaeologists have been only recently beginning to seriously look at the resistance and domination as well as the underlying power relationship. Much of the archaeological discussion of the concept of power, the common denominator of domination and resistance, have focused on either on the elite or formal sources of control in society and highly visible architecture and monumental features of which they are identified. Recent studies of resistance focus on the peasants, the rural or the marginal person, the slave, and a non-elite European. Historical archaeology has played an important role in articulating the experience of these unrepresented peoples in history. Colonial period archaeology will benefit from researchers bringing the people on the periphery of European colonies, Maroons, Native Americans, trailblazing European fortune seekers, into the center of attention. Our ability to view the dynamism of the colonial societies is thus enhanced by broadening the realm of investigation beyond the colonial plantation in the city locales. Historical supplementation and interpretation. Problems of historical relevance have been important in the pursuit of historical archaeology. The historical supplement, a term denoting archaeological contributions to neglected areas of historical research, is a classification which I will employ to characterize the work of archaeologists such as Manuel Garcia Alfredo, who investigated Jose Leta, Dominican Republic, and Elaine Nichols, who works concerning the Maroons on Culpepper Island, North Carolina. Similarly, Kathleen Deegan, who also done research at Fort Moses, also stressed the historical supplement function of Maroon archaeology. In Brazil, archaeology has helped pinpoint the location Palmares, which has been misrepresented by colonial maps of the site. Perhaps the future and a wide range of political population estimates for Palmares at ranging from 5,000 to 20,000 people can be verified or refuted. However, the historical supplement function of archaeology should only be pursued as an incidental outcome of these types of archaeological research and not as the goal. The goal should be the creation of better interpretation and enhancement of theories in which archaeology can play a role in helping to reconstruct the past. From these ethno studies of the Jamaican Maroons, we can conclude that strong affinities with the West African culture exist. Kenneth Beatty's 1980 Ethnology of Kermadi play, a ritual enacted by the Moortown Maroons of Portland, the mountainous northeast district of Jamaica, is one example of ritual and religious ties of Jamaican Maroons to the Akan culture. Kermadi is an ethnic distinction between the Moortown Maroons claim. Kermadi is most likely a distortion of the word Kermatis, which is a small settlement on the coast of Ghana from which many African slaves were shipped in the 17th century. Kofi Osas has examined the West African site of Itutu on the coast of Ghana, on the coast of Ghana, in order to create an archaeological and historical informed background against the last experience of enslaved Africans contributing to the slave and maroon populations could be interpreted. His attempts at linking artifacts such as corner and pipes on both sides of the Atlantic has met with limited success. in terms of showing African cultural influence on Maroon artifacts. Cannon's culture and Kofiana's work at Reed Steel Foundry in Northeast Jamaica provides insight to the possible transfers of African and European ironworking technology, as well as Maroon's interaction with colonial society. Maroons worked at Reeder Foundry alongside slaves in the 18th century, producing weapons and other implements. Culture proposed that the African ironwork technology was employed in blacksmith shops and secret Maroon furnaces throughout the Caribbean. Historical documents suggest that smiths and iron smelting furnaces existed in Maroon settlements at Palmares and St. James, northwest Jamaica. Manuel Garcia Alfaro has identified an iron slag at Jose Leta site in the Dominican Republic. Hence, archaeologists can advance the discourse on the transfer of African culture and technology if they can locate Maroon forges or iron smelting furnaces in the archaeological record. However, archaeological signatures of iron making or blacksmith are no guarantee of a presence of an African or European technology or knowledge. John Otto work on Cannon's Point Plantation served as a useful cautionary tale. His work suggests that slaves used European-produced ceramics in an African way. For example, they preferred using bowls instead of plates in their kitchen, just as their ancestors had in Africa. In other words, bowls outnumber plates in the material record of the slave cabinets Otto examined. However, the usage of the material item does not always explain its role in a marker of identity and its cultural significance, or its meaning of any more of an object's origin of manufacture. Similarly, clay pipes uncovered at front of Maroon sites in Cuba, Dominican Republic, and Brazil must be assessed in the light of problems of interpretation concerning artifacts. From his study of clay pipes from the Chesapeake region, Matthew Emerson has designed a convincing comparative method for exploring African traditions of pipe making and overlapping European and Native American cultural influences. Archaeologists studying Maroons will contribute to the African Diaspora archaeology if they're ever mindful of the multiple cultural influence which is embedded in the context of African cultural transfer and transformation. Maroon study provided a useful avenue to the study of allowing research to explore how societies are created through cultural interaction. In order to fully assess the range of response to colonial society by the explorers of people, a comparative perspective on Maroon plantation slaves, free blacks, urban slaves is required. The extended contact and exchange between Maroons and plantation states is an issue which can provide insight into permeability of the boundaries of slave societies, as well as the independence of Maroons and in terms of cultural identity and economics. It is important to recognize that the Native Americans preceding Maroons of African descent were both allies and enemies of the Maroons. Groups like the Mosquito Indians were employed to hunt down Jamaican Maroons. On the other hand, Brazilian American Indians such as the Morai and the Cabets both allied themselves with the Crobols. Though there is a constant intermingling of African and Native people among the Florida Maroons, Black Seminole Maroons maintain a distinctiveness from their Seminole allies and patrons. A complete assessment of the power of Native Americans and Maroons interactions must take into account the common political cause of Maroons and Native people against European colonialism and slavery. Similarly, European, though predominantly enemies of the Maroons, were sometimes allies in war and trade. In the 16th century Panama, for instance, Palinks, Spanish term for Maroonstown, were allies with English pirates such as Sir Francis Drake's. Maroons interacted with English pirates on the edges of towns and plantations which served the mining, shipbuilding, and agricultural pursuits of Spanish colonizers. The Maroons invaded the bullion of Spanish overland canvases. They exchanged gold and silver from the raids for enslaved female and scrap irons which the pirates acquired. The Maroons and English pirates conducted joint raids on both land and sea and exchanged vital knowledge concerning geography and warfare. It might be useful to ask at what point does the uniqueness and distinctness of the identity of the Maroon become apparent? Conversely, at what point do regional and local cultural identities subsume Maroon cultural identities? Maroon identity is a product of the cultural diverse community setting, which historians of the High have highlighted. The work of historian Raymond Kent, who did an analysis on the Brazilian Colombo, a Maroon enclave called Palmares, is instructive. Kent proposed that the Angolan Cambo, a ritual society, was the center of the cohesion of a ruling warrior group in Angola, was transplanted to Palmares, an African state and a Brazilian hinterland. Originally, Mocambo was a term that chronicles used to describe Maroon communities, but by the 17th century, during the height of Palmares power, the Colombo became a more popular word and has remained a key word for Brazilian communities, Maroon communities. Raymond Kent and later authors such as Stuart Swartz have stressed the multicultural Palmares, the Corones, the mulattoes, the Indians, renegade whites, and mosquitoes made up the Colombo. Native American and European artifacts, as well as locally produced earthenware, uncovered Maroon sites must be analyzed with the cultural identity of Maroons in mind. The historian of Maroon suggests two hypotheses are applicable of above-mentioned European and Native American finds. Maroons were dependent on or assimilate to slave society or any underlying European economic and social forms, and two, Maroon resisted the colonial society coincided with the occasional raiding or trading for European goods such as pottery, pipes, arms, or other commodities. These finds signify an opportunist type of resistance on the part of Maroons, but will have a high presence of European and Native artifacts suggests a preference for a European or Native-inspired culture. From the archaeology and the historiography of Maroonage, it is possible to get an impression that Maroons were simply reacting to the military and the economic of colonial societies. For example, some scholars have termed Maroon economy as parasitic, when we know that Maroons showed an agency by cultivating a wide range of crops and engaging in various trade relationships and by making their own pottery. Critiques of this view are given by Forney in 1979. Thus, one cannot assume that the European and the Native American artifacts found in Maroon sites such as Nannytown automatically translate into expressions for cultural assimilation, dependency, or association. With attention to the historical content, one can hypothesize that earlier Maroons, i.e. from Palmares, Jose Leta, or Suriname, preserved and utilized more aspects of African culture than the later groups, i.e. Jamaican Maroons or Florida Seminole Maroons. One can hypothesize that the Caribbean and Latin American Maroons were more than likely to exhibit African culture and communities than North American Maroons based on large populations of Africans to the European and the Caribbean and the Latin American plantation system. Herbert Klein hypothesized that the Maroonage in the 17th and 16th century was more restorative in character. Maroons attempted to recreate African institutions compared to the 18th, 19th century types of Maroonage, which are more assimilations in nature, i.e. religion. That is, Maroons were more likely to be creolized or assimilated to the slave society surrounding them in the latter centuries of slavery than in the former. The restorationist versus the assimilationist dichotomy that characterizes the histograph of the Maroons will more likely continue to guide the research of Maroon archaeology. See Orson's 1994 comparison of the Maroons to in a European settlement. Settlement and social organization. On special interest archaeologists and a detailed documented prescription of the Maroon settlements, soldiers and prisoners of the colonial army sent to destroy the Colombos were reported that over 200 houses, a church, and 4 smithies, 6 feet wide streets, a large beating hut, as well as cultivated fields, marked residences, monarch residence existed in the capital time of Palmares, Monaco. From the documents, we know that system of status, birthrights, slavery, and royalty developed at Palmares. Accounts of the Palmares further describe the election process, ceremonial postures, and the beings of the status figures. Besides the king and the military commander, the king's brother, there was a council of Colombo chiefs, which each of 10 settlements of Palmares, which met only to discuss collective issues such as defense. Kent, 1979, asserts that an African monarch reigned over Palmares. The most recent work on Palmares has built on African culture and linguistics analysis of Kent, and has debated the nature of Palmares as a monarch or a confederation. The input of the Africanist perspective will provide useful comparative data from which future discussions of Palmares settlements, patterns, social organizations can be formulated. Archaeologists may someday investigate whether the above mentioned African social political organization is discernible in the artifacts and the settlement layout found in Maroon sites. Archaeologists doing the work on Maroons have commented on the need for settlement and research so that the patterns of the spatial order that the Maroons employ could be examined. Thus far, the only intensive investigation in Jamaica has addressed the settlement level of analysis, and a clear pattern of community layout has not been discerned. Horticulture and fortification may be other topics that archaeologists could explore in order to expand knowledge of Maroon settlements and strategies. Comparative approaches to cultural resistance and resiliency. The final section of this paper highlights the major issue of the dynamics of cultural interaction in Maroon sites in terms of resistance and cultural sensitism. For Pentner and McGuire, resistance is conceptual as part of the dialect of domination. However, the dialect becomes a potential impediment in interpretation of Maroon sites if one assumes the conflicting interests in the social context are primarily dialectal in nature. According to historian Thomas Floor, 1979, resistance is often compartmentalized as part of the dichotomy in which opposes all accommodation and domination. This approach reinforces the traditional emphasis of the master-slave dichotomy, thereby simplifying the historical process shaping Maroon social relations. Multiple interests and levels of conflict ranging from the individual to the social to the global must be assessed and situated before the nature of Maroon societies and the meaning of their resistance can be interpreted. For this reason, comparative perspectives are necessary for Maroon studies. Within the last couple of years, scholars have begun to apply comparative perspective on Maroon societies following Richard Price, who took their approach in this book, Maroon Societies, over a decade ago. Elizabeth Briggs compared the studies of Fort Mose factual assemblage with materials from the southeastern U.S. plantations demonstrated a relative autonomy of the Fort Moses Maroons compared to the slaves in the southeast regarding diet. Regularly, Akasha led an attempt in bringing a transatlantic perspective on Maroons within the African context. Likewise, Ocean argues that the global scale of comparative studies, noting that the interpretation and analysis of Maroon sites should be both site-specific and transcontinental in scope. In light of this comparative approach, historians' illusions of Native American and European inhabitants, as well as military allies or economic partners who were present at Maroon sites, must be accounted for in archaeological interpretations. Examples include Litchfield, 1977, Kent, 1979, Paris, 1983, Riez, 1993, Auxerre, 1994 for Brazil, Bateman, 1990, and Molloy, 1993 for Florida, and Learning, 1997, 1995 for North Carolina. The question remains, at what level were the Maroons showing opposition to European cultural influence, if at all? As the discussion of resistance literature has stressed, there are many different ways to resist. The Maroons' economic independence or intermediates with Native Americans and Europeans may have allowed for cultural or physical resistance on another level. Colonware merits considerations here because of the implications of both comparative studies and cultural resistance. Leland Ferguson in 1991 suggests that colonware is an unconscious manifestation of slave resistance. His premise is colonware is a major indicator of the difference between the elite white planter class of the South Carolina coastal region and the slaves who worked in rice plantations owned by this elite. The second important argument he makes is that the colonware is West African cultural continuity. The second argument he makes is colonware is West African culture continuing. A question of one can pose given the discourse of colonware and add a nuisance is, where does the reproduction of the cultural difference in a material culture, be it an old world continuing or a new world adaptation, becomes resistance and not cultural resiliency? The implication of above discussion of resistance from the Maroon historian and anthropology is the concept of resistance is limited to explanatory capabilities. Perhaps as Michael Brown suggested, we should resist resistance and look toward the internal dynamics and contradictions and power relations of society, as well as cultural creativity and resistance from what they are the important aspects of social formation. For Maroons, this means examining both their assimilation and synchronism with Native Americans and slave societies, as well as their fight to maintain their independence. I'm going to read the conclusion. In conclusion, this paper was designed to illustrate 3 points. First, Maroon archaeology is developing stages, but shows much potential for providing a badly needed alternative to the archaeological tradition focused on the elite and European perspectives and experiences, such as the heavy emphasis on plantation contests and the study of the African diaspora. Second, there is a need to dedicate and critique literature concerning themes of relevancy to its history and historical archaeology, particularly the African cultural continuity, cultural transformation and change, cultural contact and resistance. Finally, African experiences in the diaspora have much in common and should be examined with comparative and regional perspective, as well as a critical view towards the local context. My use of the Maroon historiography has been heavily weighed to the Brazilian cases and the site of Palmares. Brazil is a good cause because it features one of the longest running slave regimes in America across a diverse environment and industry. Brazil will be a crucial area from which to examine the variety of scope of Maroonage and its influence on plantation society. Yet the Caribbean and other parts of North and Latin America will also provide an important case for study. My emphasis on African cultural continuity is indicative of the importance of a Maroon society. However, I do not mean to simplify the nature of Maroon society by implying that African culture is the only influence of Maroon communities. Rather, I want to highlight the emphasis placed on the past and present researchers of Maroon archaeology on African cultural continuity. Native Americans were also important contributors to the Maroon settlements, and their presence will be another major issue in future discussions of Maroonage. An intensive settlement study is essential for the advancement of archaeological interpretation of Maroon societies. Maroon social formation, which should not be viewed solely as a resistance to colonial society, but also as a phenomenon which intersects and engages these societies in economic and cultural dimensions. This paper contends that not only through expanded archaeological contributions to Maroon sites will understanding the African diaspora respond to the adversity as well as the motivations for cultural creativity moving beyond the limits of available colonial accounts. And there you have it. One of the good things about this paper where it states that about Palmares in Brazil, how they based it off of in the Congo, about how they based it off the African stuff in the Congo. And they have royals and stuff like that. Palmares lasted long, like I said, for almost 100 years. And how they divided it up just like the African kingdom, and how they kept it going. kept it moving and stuff like that. Not many people know about Palmares in Brazil or Culpepper Island in North Carolina. And all the other sites around there. There's many sites that they don't talk about. Maroon sites here in North America that don't get much play because they don't keep the master-slave relationship going. But if you read books like Herbert Aperture and the 250 Slave Revolts before the Civil War, it gives you a good idea that there was a lot going on. And there was a lot of Maroon sites, especially in South Carolina, North Carolina, Alabama, really all states in the South. Some in Illinois, you know what I'm saying? That don't really get discussed and don't get discussed in our history, but with brothers like Accompong a Fun Day on here, we're gonna bring it to life. So I'd like to thank you for watching, listening, and learning. Hope you learned something from this. Subscribe to the channel, hit the like button. Please share the video. This is something good for Black History Month. Have a wonderful day. Peace. And don't forget about the Cash App. Donate to the movement, man. Cash App Accompong. Peace.